Hello and welcome to another episode of Enter the Boardroom with Nurole, the business-oriented podcast that brings the boardroom to you. I'm your host, Oliver Cummings, CEO of Nurole, the board search specialist and market leader bringing science to the art of board hiring. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Mark Roberge, co-founder and managing director at Stage 2 Capital, a venture capital firm backed by elite go-to-market professionals and senior lecturer of business administration at the Harvard Business School. Mark was founding CRO of Hubspot, where he increased annualized revenue from $0 to $100 million through to IPO and grew his team from 1 to 450 employees. Mark is also author of my go-to book for thinking about sales, The Sales Acceleration Formula, and he currently sits as a board director, advisor, and/or investor on the boards of 18 early-stage ventures, including Asana, Drift, and Salsify. Mark, a huge welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today.
Hey, thanks, Oliver. Great to be here.
We're a HubSpot-driven business, and I have to say we've spent hours admiring the magic of what you built. I remember going through that journey myself of sort of thinking, well, this is exactly what we need. Please, will you help us, HubSpot, do this? And it was just absolutely masterful what you guys built there. So hugely impressed by that.
So thank you. There's a great team over there. I'm probably responsible for 1/1000th of what you've experienced there because there's so many people that has been contributing. So that's awesome. It's great to hear.
Also a huge fan of, as I mentioned, the sales acceleration formula. And what I loved about it was the way that you showed how sales can and should be seen as science rather than an art. And I think, in today's digital world in which every action is logged and masses of data sit at our fingertips, building a sales team should no longer be an art form. I'm really interested to hear about how what you learned in that growth experience translated into your experience on boards.
Yeah, quite a bit, actually. I think it was a big help to be on the operating side in the board meeting, to then be on the board side and have that empathy and perspective. And also just see, I feel like Halligan and Dharmesh did a phenomenal job of building out our board at HubSpot. So I was able to see what a high performing board looked like. And I'll draw on that today as drawing a lot of the other board experiences as well. So in terms of where does the science of sales help? There's a couple areas. First off, and just for the audience, although I have experience in a lot of different verticals through various experiences like a consultant, et cetera, a lot of this depth occurs in growth tech. Okay, so just when we're talking, that's what this has come from, and you can use it how you want to use it. Part of that is okay, when are we ready to scale? And I feel like that's a little too subjective. A lot of people are when we have product market fit. That's what most people say. But then ask people how they define product market fit, and you pretty much get a different answer from every person. So that's bad. And so there's a lot of science in there of, I personally think you have product market fit when you have a quantifiable signal that your customers are happy. And in the world that I live in, which is usually subscription software, it's on retention. I believe a company has product market fit when they have a very high customer retention. And you can translate to whatever you want in your business. Now, the issue with retention is it is a lagging indicator. It usually represents company performance that had occurred months and months ago. And so I look to define a leading indicator of retention, meaning what is happening with a customer today that if they do a behavior or a specific event occurs, if a behavior is observed by a customer consistently, that's going to lead months from now to retention, right? So there's some pretty famously documented ones at Slack. If people sent more than 2,000 team messages a month, then they were happy and hence would retain. At HubSpot, it was if a customer used at least 5 features in our 25 feature platform, right? So that's the level that we want to get to. And we, at the board level, look at that. For a very small company, look at it on a customer by customer basis monthly. At a very big level, even for $1 billion revenue businesses, we look at that as monthly acquired cohorts as to how they're tracking on that. That's an example of how to bring the science of sales into these key board decisions where they are too subjective.
I love that. And so once you've figured out that you've got an organization that's ready to scale, What's been your experience through the sort of the eyes of the board of how fast to scale?
This causes so much failure, unnecessary failure. That's obviously a key board discussion. Like, what board is not talking about, like, what should the number be next year? That's so critical. And it's amazes me, especially in the growth tech arena, how subjective, again, that is. For me, my observations, the typical way that that's defined is some board member who had sat on the board at a successful company, let's call it Snowflake. And they'll come in and be like, oh, let's go check what Snowflake did from year 2 to 3. And that should be our number. That defines the blueprint of success. We want to be like Snowflake, so that's our number. That's science. The right decision is, how fast is this company capable of scaling revenue? That's the discussion. And I do a lot of work with this on educating leadership teams and boards on how fast a company is capable of scaling. And so, like, it's pretty simple. It's basically like there's sales capacity and there's demand generation to turn demand into sales, right? So, like, you have historical data on how much demand your company has created on a weekly, monthly, and quarterly basis. It could be from marketing. It could be from cold calling SDRs. It could be from account executives going to trade shows, whatever. You have a historical record of that. You're not going to double that in a day. You can't. I mean, I guess unless you poured $10 million into paid ads, but that's not going to yield good stuff. So pay close attention to that and, like, use that as an input to this formula. Of course, you're not going to assume it's steady state. Like, put some pressure on the organization, put some pressure on the demand gen teams. But what are you going to assume? It increases 10% a month? I don't know. Just, like, put it in there, but understand what it is. So right there, we've got a formula of, like, okay, we've created this much demand in the last 6 months, month over month. And let's just assume that we're going to increase that demand flow by 10% a month for the next 6 months. And we have a historic conversion rate on that demand. On average, 5% of our marketing qualified leads close into a customer in 3 months. Like, we need to just put that into the Excel model. And, like, yeah, let's put some pressure on the team. Like, let's move that up to 7%. Great. Okay. And then we also have sales capacity. Let's look at how we have 8 salespeople on the team. On average, they've produced $60,000 of revenue a month. So if we want to double, then we have to double that team. And again, we can't do that in a day. It's going to take us probably 60 days to find the talent. It's going to probably take us 3 months to ramp the talent, depending on, and that can vary a lot depending on what we're selling. It could be 1 month, it could be 12 months. And let's use that input to the formula and figure it out. And yeah, we don't have to, like, be static at 60,000 productivity per month per rep. Let's put some pressure on the team. Let's increase that by 20% next year. Fine. Put that in the formula. But that's going to define what we're capable of growing, as opposed to just using Snowflake's number from year 2 and 3. Does that make sense, Oliver?
Yeah, completely. It resonates a lot. I mean, it takes me back to my days as an investor. I used to work in private equity, and I'll never forget some of the budget discussions we used to have, where you get these great and the good around the table saying, we've got to be doing 30% growth next year. And the management team would come back and say, well, we're budgeting 10%. And they'd get pushed back from the board and say, no, you've got to make it 30. And they felt like they were doing their job by pushing them. And of course, at the end of the year, when they came back with 10% growth that they'd predicted, everyone was going, well, why did you do that? Well, and the response was, well, we told you so. And there was never enough discussion around the formula for building up, as you put it, for where's that sales growth going to come from? And okay, if we're not happy with 10% growth and we want it to be 30%, how do we make that change rather than arbitrarily sticking a number in there?
I'm glad you framed it that way, Oliver, because that's it. It's like, let's call it revenue math. Someone told me, like, revenue math one day. I think that's pretty good. And you're right. I've actually walked boards through this, because, like, a CEO would call me and, like, my board's being ludicrous. Like, they want me to grow like 250% and I can't do it. I'm like, okay, cool. So I walked them through a little workshop and the board was like, this is awesome. Like, holy cow. I need to bring this to all my other companies. Like, so anyway, we did that with this company and we got aggressive with the numbers and increased demand gen by 10%, increased sales quota by 10%, and increased this. And like, wow, that's pretty aggressive. Cool. And it comes out to 100% growth, not 250. Like, nope, we need 250. Just like you said, Oliver, right? So when you're stuck in that, where you've got like a stubborn, then you just have to be like, okay, great. Then let's use this math to figure out how to get to 250. What do you want to do? Because we said we've never added 6 reps in a quarter. We've only added 3, and we're adding 6. Do you want to add 12? Yeah, I do. Okay, fine. You're the board. I'll add 12. So we've only closed opportunities to customers at 15% historically. In the plan, we put 22. Do you think we can double it? Yeah, you got to double it. Okay, fine. We'll put in double it. Okay. And then we come up the next quarter like, hey, we missed, by the way. Oh, why? Oh, because we only increased our close rate from 15% to 22%. We weren't able to increase our close rate from 15 to 30. You know what I mean? So at least we're having the discussion at a deeper level. And it's like, if you get fired as head of sales for increasing your close rate by 7% every quarter, like, I don't know if that's right.
So where you've seen boards doing that, where they're pushing the teams come up with options to drive hypergrowth, where do you see them most often falling short? You've talked about this concept of responsible growth in the past, but where do boards tend to go wrong in your experience when they start looking at those different levers that they can pull on?
Yeah, I would say like once they get down to that math, okay, and that once you've got down to the math, you're better than 90%. You're high performing in terms of operational cadence at that point. I would say to add to it, they would start adding in some new pixie dust. Like, oh, you know what we should do? Let's build a new product. I'll sell that. Or let's go upstream into a new market, or let's go into Europe. Let's expand into Asia. And they'll be like, let's just take one of those as an example. Okay, let's just say like, we're going to expand into Asia. All right. And like, let's get another 10 million from that. And at the same time, while we're saying this, we've never even sold in Asia before as a business. Okay. But it's like, fine, we'll figure it out. That's basically like saying when you're a brand new company with a brand new product that you're just going to get 10 million this year. You don't do that. Like no one has a business plan. It's like, yeah, I'm going to build this product this year and I'm going to get like 10 million. Like we don't know. We have to find product market fit. We have to find go-to-market fit. We have to go through the motions. And that's what you have to do when you enter a new market or sell through a new channel or sell a new product. You have to start over. And so you don't want to be in a situation where it's like, shoot, we're $10 million short. Let's build a new product or let's go into a market. What you want to be doing is experimenting in advance of the growth need. So like, hopefully you're at a point where the budget affords a few experiments. Like, okay, we're scaling mid-market in Europe right now, and we're going to go from like 15 million to 30 million. Great. But this year, we're going to run an experiment selling into Asia. We're not going to commit to any revenue on it. We're going to put 2 salespeople out there. We're going to go through the same process like it's a new company and do customer interviews and like understand discovery calls, see how the culture is different, see if there's new product gaps, see if the methodology needs to be changed because it probably does. And we're going to take the year to figure that out. And then when we come into next year, we'll be like, yeah, like let's add 10 million from Asia because we have this down.
So it sounds like what you're saying is always building a baseline so that you're extrapolating from historical performance using reason rather than hope or blind guesswork.
Yep.
Have you ever seen any organizations consistently be good with more of the faith-based sort of starting from ground zero forecasting, or is that always
Not really
a recipe for disaster?
Pretty much. I mean, they could hack their way through. First off, what I'm describing here is like, sounds like an externally organized machine. It never is that. That's your aspiration. So like you're hacking your way through, but like people figure it out, but it probably comes at a much higher cost than was necessary. You know what I mean? Like prematurely adding a bunch of reps, like, et cetera. So if you can, it would be better to run experiments initially to isolate the learning and then scale it up from there. Just like we've gotten much better as entrepreneurs at doing that at 0.0 of a business, we have to look at our growth arenas in the same way.
You've described yourself as a big planner, and that definitely comes through in the sales acceleration formula and your success with that. Have the boards that you sat on spent enough time planning in your experience?
No. I mean, there's like, when you're really early, you can't do anything about this. But like once you get to like 5, 10, 15 million, and then I know a lot of people listening are on boards much bigger than this. your next year plan has to begin in July or August. And most of them are like, they begin their annual planning in January 2nd. And it's just because, especially in the work that I do in more B2B, it's very difficult to influence the annual plan past Q1 of the year. Because a lot of the driver is like adding salespeople. There's a lot of other stuff around it, like the demand gen, et cetera. But a lot of it's just adding sales capacity. And when it takes like 30 to 60 days to fill a sales seat and 60 to 90 days to ramp them up, all of a sudden the roles you're opening in April are not having a revenue impact until late Q4. So you have to understand that in July or August of the prior year and start those processes in late Q3 or Q4 of the prior year to drive growth in the next year.
Makes a lot of sense. You've published some of your favorite quotes from business leaders on a recent trip you did with HBS. And there was one I particularly liked around remote versus in-person work, which feels to me like it touches on this whole planning thing. And you quoted them as saying that the best cultures are leaning much more into pre-reads and asynchronous communication, replacing the inefficient, expensive team meetings that simply reported out information. We were speaking briefly at the start here. You said of your 50 board meetings this year, all of them have been remote, which strikes me as incredible.
Yeah. And I don't think you'd mind me saying it. That quote was from Christian, the CEO of Glassdoor. So obviously Glassdoor is a great thought leader around culture. And I mean, I would say the 50 virtual board meetings for me this year is probably not optimal. It's probably like challenges the norm in a good way of like really the efficiency of the use between in-person and virtual meetings, which has been challenged quite a bit because of the pandemic. And I would say like the extreme of my situation is probably my own scalability. But like, I think what this meeting culture has done that I think some people are still catching up to is, first off, when we moved into like a full Zoom mode, the best practice seemed to be to cut your meetings in half and hold them twice as frequently, right? So if you were doing like an hour one-on-one with your subordinate, if you were doing an hour once a week, do 2 of them, 30 minutes twice a week, right? And so we can translate that to the board where like, I think pre-pandemic, a lot of board meetings were in person. They were quite an event, like 4 hours, sometimes at dinner before, breakfast before, like there's a lot of stuff because people were flying in. And I don't think that was optimal. And I think what they've translated to is shorter and then more frequent, meaning like there's more time within the quarter to get together for some more informal check-ins. And that's what we do a lot of, like a 30-minute to an hour check-in once a month or more frequently. Perhaps there's even a check-in a week before to discuss what topics need to be discussed at the board meeting. And then definitely there's a pre-read. I think good boards were doing pre-reads prior. I think all boards need to be doing that. And the big difference that almost all board meetings I've seen doing poorly before and haven't quite caught up is the board meeting should not be 90% a readout by the executive team. A good board meeting should be like, okay, here's the executive summary. Fine, like the CEO can give like a 2-minute little narrative, but most of it's like, you all read this before. Do you have any questions? All right, let's bring up the CFO. The CFO gives like a 90-second, like, you remember from reading this yesterday, here's what we're looking at here. What questions did you have? And there's like a 10 to 15-minute nice discussion of questions, right? Then we get to the head of product. Hey, you remember, you read this stuff. What questions did you have? So it's a lot more discussion oriented. So again, the virtual is done where there's a lot of asynchronous reading and there's a lot of pressure on the productivity of in-person time now. And I think we were talking, Oliver, it's like creative discussion, brainstorming, strategic, longer term stuff. That's where the in-person stuff occurs. And that's actually should be happening in a board meeting. So I'm probably a little suboptimal and there still should be space for in-person board discussions, but it shouldn't be 90% readout from the senior leadership team. That's suboptimal.
What do you think optimal will look like? When I look at the trends around sort of executive engagement, it looks to me like optimal productivity seems to be coming out around 3 days in person, 2 days remote. So a 60-40 split is what I saw in the latest Gallup research data. What do you think that looks like for boards? And what is the benefit in your mind of meeting in person for boards?
I haven't done a lot of thinking about that on sale ever. I can try to riff on it. I'll comment on your 60-40 on the in person. Yeah, I don't know where we end up there either. I just know in tech, we've seen a significant talent sprawl here in the US across the whole country. I'm sure other countries are seeing the same thing. And we've even seen it across the world. And I don't know, I'm torn on that. Like, I know we saw a lot of folks claim that their engineering team saw increased productivity during the pandemic. I think the only team that really suffered was like cold calling salespeople, like entry-level salespeople. But the thing I can't get past in tech is if you're, say, based in New York and you're restricting your hiring to New York, you're shutting out a huge talent pool all over the world, which could be a significant competitive disadvantage, at least just in tech, right? So I don't know. On the board level, I'm not sure. Like in general, I find board meetings generally to be not productive. I don't like being there. I like the discussion point. So I think there's a bit of upside to improve them. As long as the meeting itself is mostly the board debating and discussing and brainstorming and strategizing, then I feel like we've moved toward something more optimal. And even like that includes relationship building. Like relationship building in person, I think matters a lot. So if that's how it's structured, we're good. But again, if 90% is just a readout. So I don't think I've got anything like profound there, Oliver. Sorry.
No, that's great. And now one thing I do want to pick your brains on is around pricing. There's this wonderful quote again from this trip you did from one of the people around. Over the next decade, the most valuable specialists in the tech industry will be pricing and packaging experts. Almost all organizations are underestimating the upside that exists in optimizing their pricing model. And I definitely sat around boardrooms where literally it was finger in the air stuff, where the CEO would say, I think we should increase pricing. The chair would say, what does everyone else think? And you get one person saying, I think we should increase it. Someone else saying, no, we shouldn't. And then it would be a vote. And then either it would get increased or not. And it was so unsophisticated. How do you think about those sorts of discussions in the board?
That's an amazing example because it happens all the time. And I'm glad you brought it up. And I have a lot of experience in watching that occur and the bad aspects of it. Yeah, that quote was Dan Shapiro, my friend. He's the COO of LinkedIn. And he was not speaking nothing about the future strategy of LinkedIn. It was just like a smart Harvard Business School grad who's in a powerful position now and just seeing what he's seeing out there with like, especially the startup ecosystem. And that's the general trend I see with boards. Like, great, you're doing great. Increase your price. And I think it's like Warren Buffett is famously quoted, I believe, by saying that's a huge investment diligence proxy for him. Is if a business is able to increase price and sustain their market share capture and close rates, et cetera, which I think is smart, but I think it's easily misinterpreted. And this is what my issue is, especially in like the startup ecosystem. What happens is a business starts to get some traction. And many times the reason why they're getting traction is they're actually pioneering a new category and they've done it. And the board's like, increase price. That is a death trap if, and often they don't, have a sustainable moat. Because like once you start actually having success with a category, competitors are coming, ankle biters are coming, and incumbents, like Microsoft starts paying attention, Google starts paying attention, like, oh, there's something here. I think we can add $1 billion market share here. Let's copy it. And ankle biters are coming. They're going to come in and say, hey, look at me too. I have the exact same thing as that company. We're just half the price. And if you're increasing your price, you're making it easier for the competition to do that, as long as you don't have a sustainable moat. So you have to be very strategic about having a sustainable moat before you do that. That's tricky. And I've done some writing on that. And my biggest inspiration comes from Michael Porter, I think retired Harvard Business School professor, or active, but like very famous Harvard Business School professor, and his work in Porter's 5 Forces, one of which is barriers to entry. Now, this work is from the 70s, so it needs a little bit of like modernization, which I've done. And so he talks about things like brand. There's a reason why we buy an Armani suit that's 10 times more than another suit of like, you can barely tell the difference, but it's a brand. And that exists today in content marketing. Like we can use HubSpot as an example. We had a lot of ankle biters who like claimed they also had inbound marketing software and they sold at half the price. But we owned the concept of inbound marketing. They came to us to learn about it and they wanted to be with us. So because we were the definers of the category, they bought our stuff, even though it was more expensive. And it was the right call because the other folks were kind of imposters. And the same happened, like when I talked to the founders of Gone.io, the artificial intelligence sales coaching software, they claimed that the content marketing they did was key to them winning the category. Same with Outreach, with cold calling software, they did content. So that's an example, okay? There's other ones like if we go over to LinkedIn, like network effects. It's really hard for someone to copy LinkedIn. They have the whole network. Even just figuring out product-led growth distribution, like let's say Figma today, right? So Figma is really good at getting designers just to like download their software and start using it. That's hard to copy. And they can increase price because they're not charging until the design team has adopted it and agreed that this is right. So how do you copy Figma and charge less? It's free to start.
They're amazing. They turn my design team into their own Salesforce. Their product
Exactly.
is so good.
Exactly. And community-led growth. So those are some examples of just getting back to it, Oliver. It's like, don't just increase price because you've got a leap on the category. Pay very close attention to your sustainable moat strategy.
Really interesting. Yeah, it's one we've wrestled with a lot actually, where we, often try to invest a lot in price in order to just make our offering ridiculously good value compared to traditional search. But actually, it's been interesting. A lot of companies then didn't value it, and actually, it was only we were losing things because we weren't expensive enough. They assumed it wasn't a good quality. So definitely, that sort of rings very true in our own experience. I want to talk briefly about your stage 2 capital revenue catalyst program, which you've designed to help startups grow. Part of your offering to those startups are 3 coaches who are go-to-market leaders. I'm really interested to hear more about your experience of what those startups get from those advisors. Where do they get most value from them?
Yeah. So first off, like I just think advisory board formation is another huge opportunity of optimization and improvement across the ecosystem. First off, I see a lot of people not even form advisory boards, which is a shame because like usually these people get like whatever, a 1/10 to a 1/4 of a point, depending on the stage, and it's not expensive and it's like they can be really valuable. So form one, number one. Number two, once they form one, they basically build this like celebrity roster for their industry that ends up being supposedly coaches to the CEO, and the CEO doesn't have time to talk with 8 different people. So they have like a conversation a year, and that's not good. And so really the best design is you think about each of your functional leaders and give them an advisor, and you give them an advisor appropriate for that stage, right? So you've got your marketing leader, you've got your product leader, you got your engineering leader, you got your HR leader, you got your finance leader, you got your sales leader, whatever. Each of them has an advisor. And that advisor, I would start with just do a 1-year contract. The intention is not to have this advisor for 10 years because hopefully you're going to grow your business and evolve, and you'll need to evolve your advisor. So we start with a 1-year contract, and it could go to 2 years. It could go to 3 years, depending on the relationship and the breadth of that advisor. And so now this person actually has time to really use their advisor. And that advisor can actually develop the context of the business. This is not like a once a quarter conversation. This is hopefully more like a once a month conversation. And they're like really come up to speed on the business. The other design I like to use is having a advisor only meeting with the CEO and potentially the board, because that gives us a totally different view into the business. Because right now we're getting that view through the CEO or we're getting that view through the senior leadership team. The advisors have a totally different view. And it also, by bringing them together and letting them talk about how their functional leaders doing and their own viewpoints on the business, the advisors start to form a alignment around the strategy and can bring that into their own advisement work, right? I don't see a lot of boards doing that. And I think that's the optimal design on using advisors.
That's exactly how we run our advisory board.
Nice.
And it's been absolutely magic. Though I think there is some value. I mean, what's really interesting about the examples you've talked about is how high the cadence of turnover is, which I think is completely right, especially in those early stages. You want people turning over quite quickly at that advisory board level, according to your need. At the same time, I think there is sometimes value in having someone who's seen it through and provides some sort of continuity. So there's probably a balance there. But
I agree with
it's
that,
one of the
Oliver.
most common mistakes we see people making is hanging on to people too long and having to have an awkward discussion rather than have it 1 year up front as the expectation, have the awkward discussion of we got to move you on.
Yeah, it's 1 year and then it's not awkward. It's like, hey, thank you for your service. Or like, hey, we want to do another year. Are you up for it? And I agree with you. There's a cost to too much frequency as well. And one way to mitigate it is like a really strong onboarding program to help them understand the context deeply. So I think that's insightful.
Mark, the time has flown by, which means it's time to move on to a 6-question quickfire wrap up where I'm going to say a statement and ask you for a short response if you're ready.
Mm-hmm.
So first up, the best book every board member should read and why?
Probably go with the old school, the late Clay Christensen Innovator's Dilemma, especially right now with AI coming. Refresh that one.
Amazing. And your book should definitely be on that list as well. But no, that's a great one. Favorite quote and why?
When you're finished changing, you're finished. I think it was Ben Franklin.
I love that. Best ever holiday and why?
Oh gosh, I didn't prepare for this one. I invented a holiday called Father's Day Eve. It's the night before Father's Day. And the dad can go out, play poker, stay out late, drink beer, because you can't get in trouble the next day. So celebrate Father's Day Eve.
Love it. I'll have to initiate that one. Your most significant professional insight?
Failure is an iteration, not an endpoint. That was like definitely from observing great entrepreneurs is like most humans have a really extreme adverse reaction to failure and give up. But the best successful entrepreneurs hit that failure point and they're like, okay, cool. I learned from it. Let's iterate and go.
So interesting. You know, the same thing applies in the board world. Most people fail with their first board roles. They don't get them and most give up. And the ones who get it are the ones who persevere. Really interesting.
Yeah.
Your favorite podcast?
I like The Grit from Kleiner Perkins, my friend Jubin. I was on it. He's like the best. Like, no offense, Oliver. You're a great interviewer. You are very good. He was like really good too. he was like the best I've had. So check out The Grit.
Brilliant. I'm going to look at that one. And finally, 3 things that our listeners should take away from this podcast if they take nothing else.
Just add science to your scale strategy. Don't make it subjective. Also, like, you know, I think that advisory board design was a good one. And make sure that you're being really thoughtful about the operations around your planning exercise, specifically getting way ahead of it and not waiting until January.
Wow. Mark, thank you so much for participating. This has been such a privilege to be able to speak with you and get the value of your incredible experience. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Oliver.
And thanks to all of you listening. We've been blown away by the incredible feedback about how this podcast has been helping you get board roles and become better board members. This podcast is for you, so if you'd like to suggest guests, topics, difficult challenges, or you'd like to share stories about how the podcast has impacted you, or have suggestions on how we can improve, please email podcast@nurole.com. That's podcast@nurole.com, and let me know. I'd love to hear from you. Otherwise, thanks again for listening and look forward to having you back here for the next discussion.